I'm Aaron Nelson, and I'm doing a comparative book report comparing two books that chronicle the GOP's rise to dominance in the state of Texas. I'm comparing two books, and that would be Erica Greeter's Big, Hot, Cheap, and Right, What America Can Learn from the Strange Genius of Texas, and also Red State, an insider story of the GOP, of how the GOP came to dominate Texas politics. Big, Hot, Cheap, and Right was written by Erica Greeter. She is an editor and a journalist by profession, I believe for Texas Monthly. And so her skill in writing shows without having a very easy to read, a very engaging book full of colorful anecdotes and stories talking about the big personalities that have been within this state from the very beginning. Red State is much more methodical. It's written by Rain Thurburn, and he is a former leader of the Republican Party within the state of Texas. Like he mentions in the title, he's giving you an insider's view, and it's also sort of a victory lap where he chronicles how the Republican Party, which he is very much in allegiance to, how he was able to snatch this core of voters and doesn't want to give it back, and how he believes that the state has a very hard grasp, or the Republican Party has a very tight grasp on that conservative set of voters. While Greeter had a very relaxed style that I like to call a gumbo style because it was a blend and a mixture of various components that made the state of Texas, I say that Thurburn had a much more structured approach, and I call it even a baking approach because it took a lot of discipline and the way he laid out his arguments throughout the book, and he backed those with a lot of documentation, a lot of metrics, and a lot of stats. The book did not flow as easily as far as reading, but as far as research tools, it was carefully vetted, and he gave a lot of stats to support his argument, as well as a structure that he built early in the book to sort of lay the case for terms that he referred to later in the book. So let me hop into what I'm talking about. And I'll share some similarities as well as differences between the three books. I'm going to focus on three particular areas. One, how they both build a case or explain to the non-Texan how the origins of the state of Texas have created an environment that are very unique, and it influences the mindset of those who live within the state. Then I'll talk about the transition from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party and how these books both explain it, and how I believe that, in my opinion, veer apart in the explanation, but also a similarity that I found between the two. And then finally, I'll close with the future of the Republican Party of remaining in a dominant position in the state of Texas, and talk about how those two books both approach it, my interpretation of what they were both saying, as well as some areas that they tend to overlap to make their judgment call on where the state is headed. So, the origins of the state. Texas is one of those places where if you were to, although it's part of the United States, if you travel around the world, and I've been guilty of this myself, when you go visit someplace outside of the country, people ask you where you're from. You don't say the United States, you say you're from Texas. And people know what you're talking about, and you know they know what you're talking about. You have this sort of textbook characteristics that you think are applicable to you or your personality, that regardless of origin, gender, status, income, class, are all applicable to Texas. So both books try to set the stage for that. Greeter does it in a much more engaging way, going back to the initial tenant settlers, their negotiations with Texas, and she's sort of building the case for all of that, leading to Texans really wanting a state where they have as little government intervention as possible. That's going to be her thread going throughout the book, and so she talks about the various industries that have come and how they've all sort of bred that independent spirit. This will be cattle ranching, this will be oil, this will be the initial settler, the farmer class that came from the American South that brought things like not sharecropping, but cotton farming and slavery with them. And then that those industries changed as it spread throughout the state. But overall, she's setting up the unique history of the state. And that would be the fight for independence, the move into statehood, the colorful personalities, and she's saying how all that's uniquely Texan, ties that into the unique characters in today's politics. You hear about governors who were caught with their mistresses and died, and then of course tying it into people like Rick Perry and some of the national level quirks and flubs that he has made. But she's pretty much stating out that Texas is a very unique place with a very unique personality type, a very independent personality type, and that those who come here over time carry that same trait regardless of industry. Thurburn, he also lays out the origins of Texas, the standard history that we all hear about, and he layers on top of one another the arrival of various ethnic groups. Of course, the arrival of the Spanish settlers, and then of course their return after or their integration with Anglo settlers over time. This is before, during, and after the Texas Revolution. It talks about the disbursement of African Americans throughout the state, the arrival of Asian Americans, and then the various ethnic groups from Europe and where they settle throughout the state and what impact that's going to have. That's because he's building a case, and he builds this case of geographic settlement and population centers, and he stacks them into 4 blocks, and that would be large metropolitan areas, the suburbs that surround those metropolitan areas, more isolated metro areas, and then the traditional small town areas, and how migration of various people and their belief of conservatism into these various areas set the stage for the support of whatever political party at the time. Now, remember, greeters more like a gumbo, more relaxed, melding together religion, Texas perceptions on law, Texas perceptions on business, and the colorful personalities as all mixtures into what creates this economic engine that made Texas successful. In Red State, he's building this platform, this sort of step-by-step component of where people live, and that the majority perspective in Texas over time has always been conservatism. Now we talk about the rise of the Republican Party and the pushing away of the Democratic Party. Greeter goes through it fairly quick because she's building a case for what Texas does good at business. And she is of the mind of this independent person who never really expected much government because they never saw a lot of government, and they were still able to do good. Since they were still able to do good without a whole lot of government, there's no need to bring a lot of government into their lives now. So she sort of left the place of politics on the outside that's always allowed economic interest to do what they need to do and make this sort of contract with social interest as well. By keeping politics small, it's sort of been the playground of a select few to pave the way for business interests. And she mentions the weak Texas Constitution. She also mentions the shadow government, which would be a weak government who doesn't do a lot of things, backed by a business community and a faith community who will give services to fill in the gap. Texas started out aligned with the traditional American South. It was a slave state, broke away, it succeeded, and it sort of had this schizophrenic relationship over time where it considered itself part of the South early on, core supported policies, but due to various reasons and it took less of a brunt than other states in the South during the Civil War, but also some of the negative connotations associated with that. Currently sees itself as more of the Southwest. But through all of that, one of the vestiges of that is that the state was democratic. She describes the pushing away as having that began during Roosevelt's New Deal and she balances some racial conflict and liberal change along with the New Deal, but that Texas were pragmatic. And she gives a lot of personal stories. Whereas in Red State, he also sort of skirts the socio-political factors that were going on throughout the country during the New Deal years, then leading up to the 50s and the 60s. And he instead talks about a brand, a strong brand of the Democratic Party that existed before the Civil War, right after Reconstruction ended, and that being a Democrat was always conservative in the state of Texas, but also the gateway to power. And if you wanted power, you tried to get you had to be a Democrat, and then it became a brand where everyone just associated with the Democratic Party if you were going to rise in the political class in Texas. Um, as that brand was no longer loyal to what it stood for, in this case, conservatism, he talks about this industrious young group of people who saw this wasted brand, the Republican Party, that nobody wanted. They picked it up off the ground, made it a home for conservatism, and began to move away. He also ignores um, the, the perceptions of the dominant Anglo class in response to Lyndon Johnson's civil rights legislation and some of the women's rights or non-conservative things going on throughout the country. I won't say ignore because it is mentioned in the book, but they both tend to gloss over it and make them less of a factor than anyone who's familiar with the history of that time would probably think it to be. Finally, um, the future. The future of the Republican Party's dominance. Um, by this time, based upon Red State, the brand is strong. Because the lines between the two parties or the gaps got further apart, that conservative brand that he believes Texans are entrenched in is firmly owned by the Republicans. And he does a good job of illustrating this pipeline of Republican talent that goes back to the 60s and basically grew up in the party and left their grandparents and parents behind who were just loyal to the brand of Democrat, let them die and fade away. So now they own the brand. Greeter kind of ties together colorful analogies of mega churches, bumbling politicians, but also the influx of changing industries as well as the steadies like oil and gas to sort of like to make this combo of of states, and that Texas itself will want to remain Texas and want to remain vibrant. And the future of the party, in her perspective, is going to be tied to the Latino vote. Same thing is going to be made in Red State. They know that the large Latino demographic is going to have a say in the future of state politics. That's where it starts to differ, and that Greeter mentions that the state, as the Anglo population starts to shrink, however they're wealthier in terms, needs to set the foundation through education, and they probably will do that. Whereas in Red State, while he mentions shared cultural values, he also seems more concerned with the Republican Party keeping its grasp, and so if they won't join the Republican Party, then it might be. It seems like he is less optimistic of the Latinos applying their power through systematic lack of education, systematic access to less, and it doesn't appear that the Republican Party wants to position itself outside of smaller gestures to put itself out there to reclaim that particular vote. And so it does make for an interesting battleground for the future. I would say that the approaches laid out in Red State do give a good template for someone who wants to coalesce that vote for either side. Both were an engaging read. Both were very informative. Like I said, Greeter had a more relaxed style, whereas Red State was definitely more more formal. She talks about the people and uniqueness, whereas he talks about a methodical march towards this sort of Republican Party dominance that where we are at now. And so the two books actually complement one another because he has the stats to validate the traditional trends. However, like I said, Greeter has a more optimistic view of the state going purple or blue in the near future, whereas I think that in Red State, Thornburn is very much more doubtful that that will happen right away because Texas remains conservative to its core and probably As long as that is a core of who a Texan is, it seems like he's confident he'll stay that way. So, as Aaron Nelson, completing my report.